A rebuilt Bullard Pacific may seem an odd choice to commence our review of steam on the London Midland region, the final British Railways region to eliminate steam. The locomotive is seen on Midland depots at Leicester London Road Station on the Midland Main Line in the course of rail tour duties, an example of the many imaginative itineraries that were promoted in the 1960s, taking locomotives to parts of the system they had never been seen on before. It's followed by a native, one of the LMS-built versions of the classic Midland 4F060 design. This locomotive symbolizes the rapid elimination of steam, since it was virtually an obsolete design when built in the 1920s. Yet here it was, surviving almost to the end, alongside the far more modern designs which would, in the normal course of events, have been expected to have replaced it. The British Railways Class II tanks were the kind of locomotives which would have replaced the 4Fs. They were a development of the LMS's own final local passenger design, the Ivert Class II tanks. The word development is probably a little strong, as they were really the same as the Ivert engines with some BR standard fittings. Like all the BR standards, they had foreshortened lives, as the spate of closures at the beginning of the decade, followed by the beaching cuts, meant they were rapidly put out of a job. These engines are seen leaving Leicester on their way to work on the well-known branch along the southeastern edge of Rutland, between Seaton Junction and Stamford in Lincolnshire, together with examples of the earlier Ivert version. The branch itself passed through delightful countryside and had one intermediate station at Morcott before joining the ex-Midland line from Melton Mowbray to Peterborough at Luffenham. Its history and eventual closure was a familiar story in the post-beaching era. It was the product of Victorian rivalry between the LNWR and Midland Railway, and had originally been part of the former's Rugby to Stamford line, which had used running powers over the Midland. A desire to reach Peterborough led to a new direct line, making the Stamford line a branch. But Beeching's elimination of duplicate routes was to see both the new line and the branch close in June 1966. As ever, push-pull trains and the LMS and BR standard tanks were scrapped. LNWR lines in North Wales were also the haunts of the LMS and BR tanks, which had eventually completely replaced the various LNWR 242 and 062 tanks whose progress we have followed throughout this series. This domination was to be short-lived. The combined effect of a massive program of investment in diesel multiple units and the closure of the railways for which they were ordered meant that steam replacement on local services was accelerated. Caernarfon would keep its passenger services until the end of the decade, but the Amlwch branch, which had been dieselized in 1956, reversed the trend, steam returning from Christmas 1961 until the line's Beeching-inspired closure exactly 3 years later. Another LNWR class whose progress we have charted throughout this series is the famous Super D 080 mineral type. In the light of the history of that great railway's locomotives under the LMS, it's not surprising that these were the only LNWR locomotives to work on British railways in the 1960s. Like the early Britons, they retreated to the Welsh hills, where they shared duties on the Central Wales line with their successors and the BR standards. But by the beginning of 1964, there were only 5 left out of the original 502 engines. All would be gone by the end of the year. One would be kept for the National Collection, a fitting example of the LNWR's great tradition, a railway whose heritage had received scant attention. The Central Wales line also remains today, but Beeching and all his cost-cutting successors have tried to close it. It was to be singled and reduced to a diesel multiple unit run basic railway. In 1961, a DMU on the LNWR main line in central Birmingham crosses the Midland Main Line near Saltley as the Pines Express, before it was diverted away from the Somerset and Dorset, heads north behind the Black 5. Another member of the same class is banked by a 4F towards Camp Hill. The latter class would not be extinguished until 1966. The same Black 5 is next seen entering Walsall Station with the Pines, having virtually circumnavigated Birmingham. The chocolate and cream coach is virtually the only sign of Western region influence on the S&D's trains. But an ominous shape of things to come is symbolically waiting to take over from the Black 5. Earlier, we saw how former Great Western lines in the Birmingham district were decimated in the 1960s after they had been transferred to the London Midland region. The LMR's own inheritance of services and lines fared a little better, but many of those which served villages and communities outside the main metropolitan sprawl were to be cut back under beaching and before. Upon nationalisation, the Midlands Birmingham to Bristol main line had fallen within the Western region, but in 1958, lines north of Barnt Green reverted to the LMR. In a form of quid pro quo, the Lickey avoiding route from Barnt Green via Redditch and Evesham to Ashchurch was proposed for complete closure under beaching, passenger services from the south to Redditch having already ceased whilst the report was drawn up. Wiser counsels prevailed, and it was reduced to a stump to Redditch from the 31st of July 1964. The Cotswolds town of Evesham lost its direct route to Birmingham by these measures, and the Fowler 264 tanks, which had dominated services, were all to be withdrawn by 1966. With freight traffic in decline and the introduction of diesels on the direct main line, it was no longer necessary to keep an avoiding line for the Lickey. But, as we saw in the last volume of this series, it wasn't until the 1990s that banking up the notorious incline could be eliminated. On the Midlands main line to London in the Leicester area, we see freights headed by an 8F and 9Fs. These powerful machines had eventually eliminated the Midlands penchant for double heading, but the railway was still bedeviled with the inheritance of short four-wheeled wagons in the 1960s. Traffic was declining rapidly, and Beeching proposed to eliminate many types of freight traffic, concentrating on long-haul block trains for future growth. The combination of all these changes was catastrophic for the steam railway, as the closures of branches and local stations, the reductions of goods traffic, and the introduction of diesels and electrics all combined to eliminate steam and its infrastructure. Even modern steam locomotive types rapidly became obsolete under these pressures. The main lines were almost as much affected by beaching as the secondary ones, as the closure of wayside stations eliminated much work. The West Coast main line between Lancaster and Carlisle was to have all but 2 stations closed. Only Oxenholme and Penrith remained. Refuge sidings and the extra pairs of tracks for freight services on quadruple main lines became redundant when most of the freight was no longer there, and what remained travelled at passenger train speeds. Lines such as the Great Central, which had relied on freight for its main revenue, could no longer be justified on passenger traffic alone, and were closed. By the beginning of the 60s, it was a purely local line, as the LMR had diverted its expresses away in the late 50s. But they were to transfer some of the superb rebuilt Royal Scots here to eke out their days on local passenger duties. Displaced by diesels and electrics from the West Coast main line, they were to be withdrawn between 1962 and 1965. Their final condition mirrored that of most steam engines from 1963 onwards, as they ran unkempt and devoid of their nameplates. The Great Central was to become the last last haunt of a number of famous classes in the 60s, as, with closure expected, there were no plans to equip it with diesels. The LNER V2s and the various standard classes, 460s for passenger and 9Fs for freight, were to be its final new locomotive power.